Welcome into a special Inside Carolina podcast, show, analysis, whatever you want to call it, outside the Dean Smith Center Media Day for North Carolina basketball. Hubert Davis's first time in front of the media since the loss to Alabama way back in March. Jeremiah, I thought he was had some fun. He smiles a lot. I think he knows he's got a pretty good team.
Yeah, I mean, going into that fourth year, of course, I think he's probably getting a little bit more comfortable with some of these appearances, things like that. Still does not give the opening statement. That was funny. Right when they walked in, Kirsch was like, I think it's been 4 years, guys. Like, he's probably not going to give an opening statement, things like that. I think this is a Hubert Davis now at this point that, like I said, probably a little bit more, comfortable with those things. And like you mentioned, he knows the team that he has. A lot of I guess RJ Davis is the only Roy Williams holdover, so to speak. But other than that, all these guys are, fully his guys. And I think we, saw out there today, there has been a, tradition, I guess, kind of established in the Hubert Davis era, if you will. Obviously, the UNC has liked to play with pace for, many years now. But I think they've really honed in on that. When you talk about, when you talk to some of these new guys and you ask them about the pace, you ask them how different it is from some of the other schools that they play, and they're like, it's different. Like, it's you hear about it all the time. But in talking to Ty Claude and talking to Cade, Tyson, and talking to even Ian Jackson, who really fits this mold a lot more, they just talk about just how different it is. So, but I think in talking to Hubert Davis, there was certainly a lot to talk about because we haven't talked to him in such a long time. We really went in a range of different places, talking to him about specific players, obviously style of play, some of the trends in college basketball, like some of the exhibitions they're going to play this year. So it was certainly a very eventful day, not only talking to Hubert Davis, but talking to all these new guys as well.
Yeah, and the way it was set up, Hubert Davis met with the media for about 45 minutes to start with, and then we got players. We got returning players for 30 minutes, which were five returns. RJ, Cadeau, Jalen Withers, Washington, and Trimble, and then the newcomers came out for their 30 minutes or so, and that was quite interesting. Evan, your takeaway though from Hubert's comments, big news that the blue-white game is moving back to the Smith Center on October 12th. Of course, the devastation in the mountains has precluded that event from happening at Cherokee at Harrah's, but your take from what you heard from Hubert, I mean, like Jeremiah said, this is year 4 for him. He should be pretty comfortable. He still bristles at certain things and at certain folks, but that's Hubert. But your takeaway from his time that we had with.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that was pretty revealing that he discussed was the idea of how to replace Armando and how you can't replace Armando. Talking about how Armando Bacot, how he put it, is a one-of-one, and it's a guy that this kind of team doesn't have in terms of that just physical back-to-the-back presence. But I think that's what Hubert wants. I remember his opening press conference when he was first hired. He talked about shooting the basketball. He's an NBA guy. He wants to space the floor, even have those 5-out or just that one guy in the middle at the dunker spot kind of principles. And I think that's what you're going to have with this kind of roster. You're going to have the ability to go 5-out. You're going to have the ability to be 4-out and have a bunch of space, pace, like Jeremiah already mentioned. I mean, I could go back and check the transcript. I'm sure he said the word pace over 20 times. And during the open session that we got to watch today, not to get too far ahead, they're playing with pace. And that's good that they understand that, because that's going to be a quality of this team that I think is going to be a strength. It's not something that I think they could have maximized maybe to the fullest potential last year given the roster. But it's just going to be a different look. And I think this is a look closer to what Hubert Davis has envisioned his version of UNC, I guess, to be. I think that's been the biggest thing, looking at, the Roy Williams era to the Hubert Davis era, and how Roy was, the two big men, the high-low, those kinds of principles. Hubert wants to play more of like a modern spaced-out style, and I think that maybe invites itself more to the trends that you're seeing across college basketball, where it is higher tempo, more shooting of the 3-ball, you have those stretch bigs, and it's kind of away from those back-to-the-basket traditional bigs. And it's just going to be a totally different look, and I think Hubert is fully understanding that and fully embracing it from what we've talked about.
And if I can piggyback real quick just off what Evan said, one thing that I thought was really interesting of what Hubert said was, I was asking him about Ian Jackson, and at the very end of that answer, he starts bringing in RJ and Cadeau and Seth Trimble, and he brings up Drake Powell, and at the very end, Cade too. And he said a lot of those guys are going to play together and share the court together this year. So that really goes off of what Evan was saying of, Of course, it's not a big man oriented team. That's something that we learned really ever since Hubert got here. Even with the Brady Manic dynamic, okay, he's more stretch four kind of thing, and now it's kind of getting to a place where last year you had a Harrison Ingram who's probably more naturally a three, so to speak, but ends up playing the four. Cade Tyson's going to kind of be a similar thing. So, yeah, it's a lot of, run and gun, if you will, and a lot of, pace and space for sure.
It's going to be an interesting dynamic talking to the bigs, and I'll stay here with you, Jeremiah, is just in the little bit we saw at practice, they weren't stepping bigs out shooting threes.
Right.
The bigs on the team, Vin Allen Lubin, Ty Claude, Jalen Washington, Jalen Withers, those guys were rolling to the basket, and you mentioned the dunker spot, getting dunks and getting passes inside. I think a lot of consternation from the fan base has been they didn't go out and get a top flight elite big man. Everybody knows the story. Bacot's been was going to be gone for a long time, and for whatever reason Carolina couldn't land that big huge name at that position. But I think watching these guys, and I thought Lubin showed a little bit more athleticism and some hops that I didn't think he had as much. And even Claude did too. I'm not sure how much he'll play, but the one thing we heard from a lot of people, especially Jalen Withers, is that Jalen Washington's ready to go.
Yeah.
And he's fully healthy. I think Hubert said, correct me if I'm wrong, Hubert said he's the most in shape big of the bunch. Mm-hmm. And that's in itself is impressive given what we've seen from Washington. But I think rebounding and post defense, let's talk about that a little bit. Those are issues that folks are going to worry about. I don't necessarily think that needs to be a real major worry this year.
Well, the reality is you do need a dirty work kind of player.
Yep.
Like you do need someone that, let's say, and for this team, it's going to be the center. Some teams have, the guards that go out there. You think the Patrick Beverly kind of guy. But for this team, that's going to be their big man. They're going to need someone to go in there, get all the rebounds, play all the interior defense, things of that nature. I think one thing that they have the opportunity to do is essentially, if they have to, play center by committee. So a lot of the things that we're hearing about Jalen Washington have been really positive. Really, it's just going to be a matter of, can his defense, is there like a considerable, step up defensively? I think offensively, he's a guy that can really score in a variety of ways. I think what's kept him from getting more minutes in his first couple years, obviously the injuries the first year, we understand that. But I think last year was more so of the defense and maybe even, some of the rebounding and things like that. But what you can do, I guess the way that you play offense, it almost gives you depth at center in a weird way. So like, Jalen Withers is essentially going to be a center on this type of a team if you have Tyson and Powell playing the four. So really your centers are more so Washington, Withers, Claude, Brown, guys like that. So when I look at it, from an offensive standpoint, if you're talking about, post play, it's not something they're necessarily going to have to rely on. But I think from a rebounding perspective and a defensive perspective, yeah, you do want those guys to basically make up for the rebounds lost by not only Bacot, but really Harrison Ingram too. Mm-hmm. So you're going to have to find those guys that really are able to crash the glass from those spaces. It was actually kind of funny, me and you were talking about it earlier in there, like who's going to pick up the fouls this year for UNC, like, and really use those fouls in the right spots, I guess. But I'm really interested to see, because I think Jalen Washington is probably a guy that you can start, that first day, and it would give you some extra size on the court as well. So how are they going to mix and match those guys, behind him, alongside him, especially if you're going to, be playing really 4 guards / wings at the same time a lot this year?
Yeah, I think, Evan, on that topic, I think Carolina's got those. Harrison Ingram was on a different level as far as, and I use the word dog all the time, but just a total grinder of a player. And you're not going to replicate that. But when you've got guys like Lubin and you've got Claude even, Jalen Withers could be that type person. I think Jalen Washington's more your finesse big, your big that can step out and shoot the threes, and we saw that a little bit last year. But for Carolina in that post, to be able to defend other teams and their post players, they've got that group there that can do it. I don't think somebody like Cade Tyson's going to be like a big post defender,
right.
And I think that's where you'll see matchups are going to be key, and lineup matchups and all. But your take here on the actual post defense and the post scoring that these guys can bring, it may not be as flashy as Bacot, it may not be, it is just ugly impressively ugly sometimes from Harrison Ingram. I mean,
Right.
and I say that in the best of ways. I mean, the dude,
Certainly.
he got you down in the mud, and that's the type of players you need. I think they've got, by committee, enough to handle that aspect here.
Yeah, I think they do have the committee pieces. It's funny when you talked about Vin Allen and how the athleticism he displayed maybe caught us off guard. And I think it's almost like a sense of whiplash or vertigo, because Armando, obviously a great Tar Heel. I think his jersey needs to be in the rafters. At the end of the day, he wasn't the most athletic guy in the world. Same with Harrison Ingram. I mean, everyone joked about him having that old man athleticism. And they've got guys that are, good athletes. I think that's about. I think another thing when we're talking about post defense and really the rebounding aspect that's going to be different and key with this team is the athleticism they have at the wing and at the 3 spot. When you've got a guy like Ian Jackson and Drake Powell, I mean, those are professional level athletes. That's why you're seeing those guys, in these early mock drafts as high as in the lottery. It's because they have that next level athleticism, and that's something that UNC just didn't have last season, really outside of maybe a Seth Trimble if he played at that small 3 spot. So I think those guys are going to be key in the rebounding conversation. They're going to have to rebound more than maybe they've ever rebounded in their careers, being, 5-star guys that are probably more scoring-oriented, or if you're talking about Drake, more of a defensive-oriented guy. And I think they're going to be key in helping in, post defense in terms of just off-ball help, or just helping provide resistance to some of those big men. I remember Armando talked about last season how, Hubert placed an emphasis on one-on-one defense in the post. And Armando liked that challenge of where he knew that someone isn't going to help me off ball. This is a one-on-one, this is a man-on-man challenge. You saw it with DJ Burns a lot last year.
Absolutely.
I don't think UNC has the big men this season to where they can necessarily go to that full-on, hey, we don't help off the ball. I think they are going to have that kind of help in there, and I think you have the wings and the guards and the athleticism to particularly do that and be successful.
Yeah, and that's a big, and first of all, we don't need to talk about R.J. Davis. I mean, everybody knows what R.J. Davis can. I mean, you guys agree? I mean,
he looks good. He hit his threes. I mean, what else do you know about him?
I mean, his leadership has been amazing. Hubert's talked about. I ask all the young guys about R.J.'s ability to lead. He's seen everything. There's nothing in college basketball he hadn't seen. And somebody asked, how can RJ be better? Well, Hubert said, just do what you did last year. That was a historic year, Hubert called it. So I think we know what we're going to see with RJ Davis. So I don't want to make too much about him. The leadership will be key. Elliot Cadeau is a guy who we sort of know what he brings to the table. He's got to shoot it better, and he's got to have more confidence doing it. He talked about that. But I think this team is made or broken, and this is my hot take for the day, is that on the wing, whether it's Cade Tyson, whether it's Ian Jackson, Drake Powell, Seth Trimble looks significantly bigger. I mean, he could run up the hill here, put on the football pads, and play safety for North Carolina, for Mac Brown. I mean, he is built, he is put in the work in the offseason. But Jeremiah, let's talk about those wing positions, Tyson, Jackson, Powell. I think this is where this team can sort of separate itself from everybody except maybe the elites, the ultra elites. But I think this is what can make them really competitive and very good in the ACC if those guys step up and play like we think they can.
Yeah, I mean, those specific guys that you named, I just think there's such a diversity in skill set with all of them. So obviously you have Tyson, who's going to be a guy that you want to rely on to essentially be your knockdown shooter, so to speak. You have Ian Jackson, who, of course, is a very offensively talented guy, and he could be on any other team. He's probably a straight-up point guard, shooting guard. But on this team, you kind of have him, on the wing. And he's obviously a guy that's not afraid to shoot the ball. Even when he's on the court with R.J. Davis, he's not afraid to shoot the ball. And then you have Drake Powell, who I think is a very interesting part of this team. We were watching the drill today where, the guard is getting the ball out of the basket and they're, pushing it ahead and things like that. And then obviously guards push it to the other guards to, kind of bring the ball up. And during those drills, they had Drake at guard. And this is a guy that some of the teammates have talked about him maybe being able to be at that 4, but they had him as a guard. They had him bring the ball up. So I thought that was a really interesting part. So this is a team that probably has more ball handlers than it did last year because of the wings that we're talking about. So you do have different guys that can kind of bring it up at times, which is pretty big when you have, I know earlier we were talking about, having Jackson and having Powell be more involved in the rebounding game. If those guys get the defensive rebounds, they can go ahead and push it. They don't have to look for anybody. Those are the guys that you want with the ball. So I think if you talk about those guys, at the wing position, I think it gives you a different dynamic of what you had last year. you're talking about just a straight up wing. Like obviously Cormac, he's mostly catch and shoot. Not the strongest necessarily taking it to the rim. I think Ian Jackson kind of gives you that. So that's just an example of, what you can kind of do from that spot. So I think when you talk about those three guys specifically and just how different they can be, because they can be on the court, for the most part at the same time, where, you can kind of break it up and things like that, because that's already, if you're not bringing in a RJ, you're not bringing in a Cade, you're talking about guys that can really create their own shot and and obviously put the ball in the basket at a high rate. So if this is a UNC team that's going to move up and down like it's going to and score potentially even more than they did last year, it does start with the wings, and it does kind of sacrifice some of the points that you were getting from Armando, but I think you can get a higher versatility of points. Like you can get points from different ways, getting it from those three guys from the wing spots rather than what you were getting probably at that center position last year.
Yeah, and that versatility also, Evan. I mean, we've talked a lot, and we saw it last year, and I mentioned it in there when we were watching practice, is if they're going to start, if Cade and RJ start at the 1 and 2 or 1 and 1A positions, they're going to have defensive issues. We saw that repeatedly last year. Will you play a guy like Drake Powell at the 3 or Ian Jackson at the 3 or even one of those guys at the 4 and play them both on the court together? You got somebody that can match up defensively when another team has a 6'5" guard that will take RJ or Elliott down in the post. I think this season comes down to Cade Tyson and his ability to shoot it. We saw 2 years ago, 3 years ago, whenever 2022 was, at time's flying, folks, that team did not take off until somebody started hitting shots, and that guy was Brady Manning. Now, the easy thing to do here and the lazy thing to do here is to say that Cade Tyson is this year's Brady Manning for various reasons, but mainly just to be lazy. But it still comes down to Cade Tyson's ability to shoot. He is very confident. He played at Belmont, which is a big step up to here, but he said it, shooters shoot, and shooters can shoot. Your take there, and I'm coming with the starting lineup. So you marinate on that because that's next. But Cade Tyson's ability to change the dynamic for this team, in addition to having Drake and Ian Jackson and their athletic ability to handle that defensive setup if necessary in the front court.
Yeah, I'm actually not concerned at all about his shooting. I think it's going to translate fine. I think we saw in the limited portions we did, he shot at a super high clip after missing one early. It's a fluid motion. It's a quick motion. And kind of like he said, and I think just in general, I think shooting does translate pretty well when you're making that step up. And Belmont, yes, is a mid-major school, but it is one of the more competitive and higher quality mid-major schools in the country. I mean, just a few years ago, we're talking about Ben Shepherd, who was at Belmont. He was playing for the Indiana Pacers. I mean, we're talking about an NBA draft pick that came from Belmont, and he's a good guy. And so that's who he's been around. I think what also helps is he, obviously he's the younger brother, Hunter Tyson, played at Clemson forever, and now is with the Denver Nuggets. I think that helps a lot to it.
Yep.
I think with Cade, if we're talking what's pivotal for him in terms of UNC maximizing what it's got out of its players this season, it's going to be him on the defensive end. I want to see how he can defend, higher level athletes, whether that's on the wing at the 3 or if it's at the 4. And how does his rebounding kind of translate? I think that is something that is going to be super critical for him. It's something he talked about, getting that, his feet kind of under him and adjusting to it. In terms of the shooting, I think, he seemed pretty confident. When you talked to some other guys, I remember Jalen Withers had a funny quote in there about how he hadn't seen Cade miss a 3 in a month and a half. I mean,
shades of Jeff Lebo for the old people out there.
He's a guy that's going to be able to shoot, and I think when you put him into that whole wing room, what UNC has at that wing just group, if we're talking like Cade Tyson, Drake Powell, and Ian Jackson, it's creators, and I don't think they necessarily had that last year. Cormac played a really good role, but was he a guy you could trust to maybe create his own shot with the ball in his hand? Maybe not 100% of the time. Harrison Ingram, again, filled a really good role. You saw he kind of had those post-ups working at the beginning of the year. Once you got into ACC play and you're playing against higher-level athletes, you kind of saw the efficiency rate of those kind of go down. So I think UNC is going to have high-level creators on the wing that, frankly, they haven't had here in a really long time. And it's something that you see, and I'm not saying UNC is going to win the national championship, but when you look at these teams of recent past, the UConn team specifically, they've always had NBA high-level creators on the wing. You look at Stephon Castle last season. You look when they had Andre Jackson and Coleman Hawkins. I mean, or not Coleman Hawkins. God, what's the Hawkins kid's name? You know what I'm talking about?
I don't.
You don't know what I'm talking about?
Give me one more time.
The Hawkins guy, he was a lottery pick at UConn. Jordan Hawkins. No, is it Jordan Hawkins?
Oh,
it's great radio.
This is great radio, by the way.
Yeah.
Not Coleman Hawkins. I was thinking Coleman Hawkins, but he's at Kansas State now. But anyway, my
Bottom
point
line,
being
dudes
is
that could
they have creators.
yes,
on the wing.
and they could score with their
Yeah.
athleticism
And, like,
and get it done.
When I'm thinking in my mind like of a wing creator that could create, is it Justin Jackson? Is that the last one maybe who's been here? Maybe Cam Johnson, I guess you could probably throw there.
I would say Justin was probably more straight creator.
Right.
Cam's probably more straight
Cam's
knockdown
more of like
shooter.
straight knockdown. Like
Yeah.
I mean, they haven't had that here
Yeah.
since the Hubert Davis rendition or
Yep.
whatever you want to call it. So, I think this is something that's just gonna be different, and it's gonna be important for this team to have success.
Yeah, and the point being in all this discussion is they have options, but 5 have to start. And if I had a nickel for every time everybody asks who's the starting 5, I will say this: R.J. Davis is going to start.
You think so?
Wow.
Beyond that,
Is that your hottest take?
Beyond that, I don't know if you can solidly say this will be the starting lineup.
There's 2.
You wouldn't put Cadeau
Elliot's
there?
gonna start.
You think Cadeau
I would put
starts?
He has to
I would say
start.
so we agree on Cadeau starting
Cadeau
too.
has to.
Yeah.
All right, so we got RJ and Cadeau,
Yeah.
which is also a 6 or sub 6 foot front
Certainly.
backcourt.
It is.
So that shapes the rest of it. Who's the rest of it, Jeremiah?
In my opinion, that's the backcourt. I personally have Ian Jackson at that 3 spot, which in college, and he's about 6'4", 6'5", the hair might get him to 6'5", 6'6". But in college, we've kind of seen lineups like that where, you're 3. In the NBA, it's more so a 6'8" guy, but in college, it can be 6'5". I do think Cade Tyson slots in at that stretch 4, and this is where it gets tricky. I'm not dodging the question, I'm just breaking down my logic, right? Because I am going to give an answer. On one end, do you put Jalen Washington in there for the size and for the pick and pop element because of the fact that Elliot Cadeau is not necessarily the strongest 3-point shooter, or, and this is what I think probably fits more to their style and kind of goes against what I was saying earlier about Washington potentially being able to start. But when I look at the way, and we saw it in practice today, the way they like to get up and down, the way they like to move, that fits more of a Jalen Withers and more of a Van Allen Lubin kind of style. And Van Allen Lubin, he was looking pretty good out there as well. And it's interesting, Withers played more minutes per game than Washington did last year. Withers was about 12 minutes a game. Washington was like a tick under 9 minutes a game. Theoretically, Withers would probably be quote unquote ahead of him in a depth chart if you just went based off of last year. So I think the player that would fit that lineup the best, I think, would be Jalen Withers. Now that would, again, that's experience with the team, and this is obviously a week 1 type deal. And this is just what I'm thinking, right? I'm thinking more so day 1 starters. I'm not thinking necessarily all throughout the season. Paxton Wojcik started the first game last
Stole my
year.
thunder there.
Elliot Cadeau did not start the first game last year. The first few games of the season, actually, they had Seth Trimble in there. They changed the lineup a lot early on last year, and they were just kind of experimenting, and maybe part of that is trying to bring Elliot Cadeau along. I don't know, but I think that center spot is tricky. I think just kind of based on if I'm being asked to being about, I'm gonna put Withers at that 5th spot. I'm almost 100% sure that's gonna change after the first game or after the first 3 games or whatever. I think UNC's gonna experiment a little bit like they did last. 6 or 7, they're going to settle into one that they like. So if I had to call it today, I'd probably go Cadeau, RJ, I'd probably go, Jackson, Tyson, and I would put Jalen Withers in there. Washington would probably be the first center off the bench. I don't really know exactly where Lubin fits in as far as he'll play, but I don't know what, do I want him as a 4? Do I want him more so as a small ball 5? I don't really know. He'll definitely play. I just don't know exactly where they're going to slot him.
Yeah, defense would worry me with that line. Like, you got Cade Tyson, who we talked about, is going to have to grow into that defensive role just like Manic did.
Yep.
Another lazy comparison.
Yep.
But Manic figured it out, against somebody like Paolo Banchero, who was a monster, and Manic managed to do it. So if Tyson can do that, I like that lineup. Ian Jackson can play the defense. Drake Powell can play the defense.
Yep.
RJ and Elliott aren't going to get any taller, so that's going to be an issue. So this is where Hubert really has to work these out, and they don't really have an option to figure it out. They jump right into it in this schedule. There's no, like 3 months or 3 weeks worth of cupcakes. So you get the last word. I'm not sure how the youngest one gets the last word, but your take here on the starting lineup. Game one. We'll go game one. Not that ultimately matters,
Right.
but game one, maybe first week or two of the season.
Yeah, so it's funny that Jeremiah mentioned the Paxson Wojcik starting
Yeah, that
because
teed
that was what I was going to bring up, and
Oh,
that
right.
your day one starting lineup may not be the same as it is at the end of the year, but also when they were feeling out that starting lineup last year, it's because they could, because they had that runway to go off. These guys play at Allen Fieldhouse the first week of the season, second game, so they don't really have is that second game of the year going to decide their fate? Like, of course not. It's the second game of the year. But they don't have as much time to feel it out. I like the first four in Jeremiah's starting lineup. I do think it's going to be a Cadeau, R.J. Davis, Ian Jackson, and Cade Tyson.
So we agree it's Ian
1 through
Jackson
4.
and not Drake Powell.
I do solely from I think you do need another consistent scorer on the wing. Unless Elliot Cadeau can prove that he has taken that leap forward offensively, I think you do need a guy who can score at the wing.
I think Jackson spaces the floor better.
And I think Jackson's going to be the second leading scorer on this team.
I agree.
I really do. I just think from a guy that was talked about at the high school level, someone who struggled to shoot the ball, and his numbers support that, his shot looks really smooth for a guy who isn't labeled as a shooter. He's super athletic. He can take the ball off the dribble. I think he's going to fit really nicely along these pieces. And then I think at the 5, it's going to be Jalen Washington. And really only from the standpoint of, I think for UNC to achieve, its goals this season, it needs Jalen Washington to start the 5. I don't think you can compete against some of those higher level teams that are still going to have those big, physical, imposing big men with a guy like Withers or Ben Allen, because I think they're going to just struggle from a sheer height standpoint. And people forget, Jalen Washington has like a 7'4", 7'5" wingspan. He had some moments last year, whether it was a dunk over someone or a block, where you're like, whoa. And you're kind of taken back just because he kind of moved like, a deer in headlights or like a baby giraffe in a way, where it's like, he hasn't really got his limbs under him. I think you're going to need him to take that step forward. And the only way to take that step forward is throw him in the game. And he's got to work through it. So that would be my day one starting 5. Is it going to be the starting 5 in March? I don't know. I like the idea of, maybe having Drake Powell at the 4 potentially if, that's better fits later in the season. But I would go Elliot Cadeau, R.J. Davis, Ian Jackson, Cade Tyson, Jalen Washington.
I think we need to hear Tommy's 5. I feel like Tommy's kind of cringed at our 5s as we said.
I mean, my thing is I don't know if you need to start Cadeau. And I think...
What?
I'm just saying.
I know.
My concern with those lineups that you guys put out there is playing defense.
Certainly.
In a perfect world, Cade Tyson plays the 3. And then you can play Vin Allen, Lubin, and Withers, and you can have some size.
Are you saying that Ian would be at the 2? Is that what
and
your
then you
perfect
could
world would
push
be?
those guys up there. But I'm not sure Tyson can guard high-level 3s. I don't know. And that's something we'll see.
Certainly.
The concern for me, and I'm the pessimist in the group, obviously the concern is guarding taller guards. Carolina has struggled with that. Just, it has nothing to do with talent or skill. It has everything to do with size and matchups. And then at that 4 position, Cade Tyson is a perfect 4 for this team. But they don't have a perfect 5 to blend like you're talking about. That's why you got Withers, you got Washington. So for me, it would not surprise me to see one of those guys pushed to the bench and get a Vin Allen Lubin in with a Jalen Washington or something like that. We'll see. But like Hubert said, those guys are going to be on the court a lot together.
Positionless basketball. That's what he mentioned.
And it is 100% that. And the thing is, it's going to be all about matchups. And Carolina this year has a better opportunity to match up with different teams than they've had in years past. Because as great as Bacot was, he wasn't always the best matchup for somebody that had a massive stretch 5.
A guy like Grant Nelson at Alabama.
Or the kid for UConn, or whoever they played in the Bahamas.
Eric Dixon,
Villanova.
Yeah.
That absolutely. So you have that issue. And Bacot on our show with Joey Powell and myself said the one game that bothers him to this day is Dixon handing him 30.
Yeah.
And so Hubert has options. We've got plenty of coverage at Inside Carolina. These guys are writing the articles. These guys did the interviews. You'll have interviews from every player. You've got coaches interviewed up there, and you've got plenty of content from Adam and the gang. Stay tuned to Inside Carolina for all the coverage of Tar Heel basketball.